Many players who are first acquainting themselves with endgame activities in Destiny 2 often find themselves wondering what the best damage strategies are in different activities. Should I use a linear fusion rifle, Galahorn and legendary rockets, ability-based damage? Should we use Lumina? Through this video series, I hope to answer all of these questions as comprehensively as possible while providing players with a logical framework that will help them assess new damage situations and effectively create optimal damage strategies of their own. While these videos will focus largely on the bosses where damage matters the most, like in raids and dungeons, they will also take into account other activities where damage can be optimized, like Grandmaster Nightfalls and Legend Plus Lost Sectors. This video series will be broken down into 7 parts, each detailing a different section of information dedicated to understanding the ins and outs of the damage meta in Destiny 2. In parts 1 and 2, we'll discuss what to think about when deciding what to use for damage. In part 3, we'll talk about setting up damage, and in parts 4 and 5, we'll go over the current meta and damage rotations, with plans to seasonally revisit the section as needed to account for meta changes. Finally, in part 6, we'll apply our knowledge to some real examples that are currently in the game, and as a footnote, for part 7, we'll talk about some tips for damage testing in new scenarios that aren't in the game yet. With that out of the way, part 1, Considerations. From activity modifiers to damage duration, many factors can affect what the optimal damage strategy in an encounter ends up being. In this section, we're going to discuss the factors that stem from the activity itself, rather than from player composition or the current season's options. Outside of personal preference or convenience, these factors can be split up into 9 major categories: damage mechanics, damage timing, enemy health, enemy model, enemy type, enemy behavior, engagement range, enemy availability, and other miscellaneous factors. Using these factors, we'll learn how and why certain options are used to optimally damage bosses of all types. Starting off, what do I mean by damage mechanics? Damage mechanics, like the fixed ability regeneration given to players by the Time's Vengeance buff in the Atheon encounter, can drastically affect which weapons, abilities, and exotics you choose for your loadout when deciding on a damage strategy. For example, players use the exceedingly high grenade throw rate given by Time's Vengeance to take advantage of exotics that hugely buff grenade damage that normally still require a relatively long cooldown between grenade throws, like Verity's Brow and Heart of Inmost Light. This is just one example though. Damage mechanics are a very broad category that encompass boss fight specific buffs like Ruinous Resonance, and encounter mechanics like Brand Claiming in War Priest and Threshold damage in Caretaker. These buffs and mechanics change which players can do damage when, as well as what those players will be doing damage with. Another important factor to consider is damage timing. That is to say, when does damage start? When does damage end? How long is the damage phase? How long do you have before damage to feasibly set up whatever you need to in order to do more damage? Some bosses have extremely short phases, like Atrax, while other bosses have exceedingly drawn out phases, like Rulk. How long you have to damage a boss can make burst damage weapons and abilities like Parasite and Blade Barrage more favorable over more extended damage options like Rocket Rotations and Gathering Storm. Some bosses have almost no time for setup, like Templar, while others have a very high amount of downtime before they become damageable, like Atheon. Usually this factor changes your ability to build up stacked benefits from exotics or mods, or perform other tasks that involve killing enemies or setting up ahead of the damage phase. Total boss health is also a factor in choosing your weapons. Weapons that favor short, bursty damage phases tend to have lower total reserves, and you can't kill a boss if you shoot all your ammo and the boss isn't dead. While other mechanical factors are generally more impactful than this one, if a boss has an extremely high or extremely low amount of health, this factor can definitely have a significant impact on what supers and weapons you choose for a damage scenario. Grand Overture might make sense on a boss like Morgeth, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a viable damage strategy involving it on War Priest or Rulk. The actual physical model of a boss or damage target can also affect what decisions you make when doing damage to it. Some bosses in Destiny 2 have modified crit sizes, shapes, and multipliers, and that can affect what kind of weapons you choose to use on them. A famous example is the Techian or Wizard boss model present in many activities, like Sadia from the Corrupted Strike or Kali and Shirochi from the Last Wish raid. These bosses seem to have a separate head entity that takes twice the damage of a normal crit, including impact damage from weapons like grenade launchers, which do not typically register increased precision damage. This results in certain precision weapons like snipers and slug shotguns being hugely favorable in encounters with bosses using this model. Even the shape of a boss can affect the viability of certain weapons. Speedrunners use Dimensional Hypotrochoid on Riven because it can bounce between the folds of her body and do much more damage than it would against another typical boss. On top of this, some bosses share characteristics with certain enemy types, which makes them more susceptible to certain damage classifications. For example, Percy's Inspire of the Watcher takes increased ability damage as a result of being coded as a wyvern, which has encouraged players to use Well of Radiance to convert their weapon damage into super damage. Another more obvious example is certain bosses being classified as Taken, like the ones present in the Last Wish raid, which warrants the use of Taken spec. Some bosses are also famously classified as vehicles, which makes the Wardcliff Coil particularly effective against them, notably Dolan from the Shattered Throne dungeon and Hashladun from the Scarlet Cape Strike. Another consideration related to bosses is AI or behavior. Now, because most bosses are relatively static in Destiny 2, this might not seem like a big deal. However, given that Bungie's most recent bosses, including Rolk, Nezarec, and Samuma, have penchants for moving around, this factor has recently become a more prominent consideration in damage strategies. With dynamic movement that strays from the typical Destiny philosophy of finish mechanics, stand still, and shoot boss, bosses like these will continue to affect what weapons players choose to use in future seasons of Destiny 2. Generally speaking, if a boss is more unpredictable or aerial in its behavior, then the viability of slow projectile weapons and abilities goes down, as well as the use of close-range camera tracking or high-precision weapons like swords, shotguns, linears, and melee-based damage builds. Usually, engagement range is something most players take for granted, but when the first few weeks of a raid pass by and the most enthusiastic players are testing what to use on a boss, this is often something that is taken into consideration. At extreme ends, bosses like Kali are engaged at extremely close range, while others like the Sanctified Mind are so far away that they are out of most weapons' effective ranges. Swapping shotguns is often used in high damage weapon rotations. A strategy like this becomes a lot less viable or even impossible on some bosses that are too far away to reach, even with the assistance of a Lunafaction well. Another damage consideration, though situational, is enemy availability. Weaker enemies and their availability during or before a damage phase can change the viability of strategies using said enemies to keep up time-limited buffs. Enemy availability has two properties, quantity and proximity to damage or the boss. If there are no enemies during damage or before damage, like in the case of Warpriest or Templar, it can be more difficult or even impossible to use certain damage strategies reliant on short buff timers, like Death Throes or Burning Fists. In addition to this, some bosses despawn enemies right before damage or during damage, like Rolk and Oryx, meaning that while it might be possible to use these enemies to generate some sort of lasting effect like Armor Charge, buffs that require a sustained enemy presence like Biotic Enhancements and Surrounded become harder to use. The last major damage consideration category is miscellaneous, often activity-specific factors. These considerations generally involve modifiers impacting certain damage types or activity-locked mods. For example, in a Void Surge Grandmaster Nightfall, you would prefer a Void Rocket over a Solar one even if the Solar one has better damage perks. The same applies to overcharges. Some activity-locked mods can be very impactful too. Last Wish, Garden of Salvation, and Vow the Disciple have hugely impactful damage-related mods in the form of Blessing and Curse mods, Enhanced Relay Defender, and Into the Light. Often in Destiny 2 damage discussions, we talk a lot about the best weapons and how to use them. But when designing a strategy from the ground up, the first thing that comes to mind isn't weapons, but rather the associated damage environment. Since this isn't something I've seen explained very often, I thought it was a natural first step in this journey through damage in Destiny 2. In the next section, we're going to discuss team structure, including buffs, debuffs, amplifiers, and exotics. Hopefully you'll be able to see some of the connections between the considerations described here and the decisions endgame players often make when structuring their damage strategies in the next video. See you there.